Hey folks, welcome to another Passion for Sound audio review. I'm excited today to share with you a brand new product due for release at about the same time this video is going to drop, and that's the Burson Soloist 3X in front of me here. This is a fully discrete design amplifier from Burson Audio, who make the V6 Vivid, the V6 Classic, the V5 op amps, and also products like the Conductor, the Fun, the Play, and the Swing. So you may have already had experience with some of Burson's products, but I'm here to tell you today that this might be the best one that I've come across yet. Keeping in mind I haven't heard the new Conductor, but this new Soloist is absolutely fantastic. So let's get into the review and I'll explain why. A couple of pieces of housekeeping before we get into the review. I've got a construction site next door at the moment, so I apologise. You may hear some nail guns, some saws, some bits and pieces like that in the background. I apologise for that. I'll try and edit out any that I can, but a few of them might sneak through. The other thing I wanted to mention is that this amp is on a very quick turnaround time on loan from Burson. It's got to go on to other reviewers, so it hasn't been given to me or anything like that. This is entirely a review based on the merit of the products. Now I say that and I put emphasis on that today because I'm about to say really fantastic things about this product. It is absolutely sensational. So let's start talking about what it is. The Soloist 3X is the new version of Burson's Soloist line of amplifiers, which have been known for quite some time as being outstanding performance amplifiers at a pretty reasonable price. The other thing that sets them apart from a lot of the competition is that they're a fully discrete design, meaning that everything inside is an independent component rather than integrated chip-style op amps and similar processors. All of the amplification handled within the Soloist is done using things like transistors, capacitors, resistors, and the like. The theory behind that is that you're going to get a purer, more analog or natural sound as a result, and I can definitely tell you it's doing good things here. The Soloist is going to retail for about $1,150 US, I think $1,144 exactly, which equates to just under 1,600 Australian dollars. So it's not a cheap amplifier, but it's also not as expensive as something like the Sparkos Labs Aries that I reviewed on this channel. So I was really keen to see how it stacked up in terms of performance. Speaking of performance, the Soloist can output up to 8 watts of power into 16 ohms, which means about 4 watts of power into 32 ohms. So in other words, it's got more power than you're ever going to need for any headphone that I can think of. All of that power is delivered from a Class A discrete circuit, as I've mentioned before. So it's also going to give you a very, very pure, clean sound as a result of that Class A design. Now, if you're not familiar with Class A, that delineates a design that is focused on maximum performance from a sound quality point of view at the cost of a loss of efficiency. So the amplifier is going to run a bit hotter, it does waste quite a bit of energy, but the idea is it gives you the best possible sound quality. Before I talk about some of the specific technologies in the Soloist, and of course then the sound quality of the Soloist, I want to start by talking a bit about the design. So as you can see here, the Soloist is in a brushed aluminium style casing front and back, and it's got this ribbed heatsink style casing. Something that's really important to know about it is it's designed to be opened up because it is op-amp swappable. And that's why I've got a pair of Burson Audio V6 Classics here on my desk to go into the amplifier for my testing. One thing I really like about the design of this amplifier is that they've gone for a very simple approach. We've got 4 screws in each of the corners on the bottom. That's these screws here on my desk. And those screws then allow you to remove the top half of sort of the clamshell style design, if you like, and access the inside of the amplifier. So you can see here, as I said before, that we've got an amplifier that is entirely made up of discrete components. There's no IC chips here doing any of the amplification processes, and therefore you're going to get this beautiful analog Class A style sound. But don't think that means it's a thick, rich, smooth, warm sound. It's clean and it's transparent, as I'll talk about soon, but just very, very smooth in its delivery. The other thing you might notice as I'm holding this up is 2 sets of V6 Vivid op amps in here. Now I'll explain what they're doing shortly because part of that's about one of the technologies built in to the Soloist 3X. Before I do though, let's take a look at what the amplifier has on the front and on the back. On the front here, we've got the power switch first and foremost. We've got a 4-pin XLR output for fully balanced headphone drive. We've got a 6.3mm headphone jack for single-ended. And then we've got a headset style jack, so you can use gaming headsets with microphones here. And there's a pass-through, which I'll show you in a moment, on the back to send the microphone signal into your computer. Continuing on though, we've got a nice white LED display here, or OLED, I'm not actually sure. And then we've got the volume control, which is also a rotary dial for for the menu, and so you can press it in for mute when it's in playback mode, or for selecting the options in the menu when you're in the menu. Speaking of the menu, on the end here, we've got the menu button which opens up the menu, and a long press will put it into bypass mode, which I'll talk about shortly. Swinging around to the back, we've got a pair of XLR inputs because this is a fully balanced amplifier. We've got a pair of RCA inputs, and we've got a pair of XLR outputs for using this as a preamp. So essentially this is continuing the theme that I've been looking at recently, just by coincidence, of things like the Schiit Magnus, which are fully balanced amplifiers and also balanced preamps. The Topping A90 being another example. So this was really timely in many ways because I've had lots of experience with these lately, and I have a number of benchmark type devices in mind to see how this stacks up. Before we get to that though, let's talk about those technologies I've alluded to. But before I do, I just realized I forgot two things on the back, one of them being the power supply input. That's going to be important with what I'm about to say in a moment, and the other one being that pass-through microphone output that I mentioned earlier that goes out to your computer if you're using a gaming headset. Now that that's out of the way, let's actually talk about those technologies. So the first one relates to the power, which is what reminded me I'd forgotten the output there. The power supply in the Burson Soloist is unique, and it's a special design that Burson have actually come up with themselves. What the power supply approach does is it takes the incoming power, it filters it and converts it using transistors rather than coils, and the end result is a 170 kilohertz power frequency. What that means is that there's none of the 50-60 hertz buzz that you might get from a normal main style power supply. And instead what you've got is any power noise is pushed way out of our audible range. So the theory behind that is we can get really clean power in terms of what's audible. I'm not equipped to do specific testing of that, but what I'm hearing suggests that everything's working pretty well given how clean that sounds. The other key technology to be aware of in the Soloist is its volume control. So Burson have implemented a Muses 72320 chip as the volume controller. Now I said before this is a fully discrete design. That's in terms of the amplification circuit. Obviously the volume control is being handled by an integrated chip. What that chip allows though is very precise steps of control, which means perfect channel balance at all levels of the volume. That volume control is also where two of these Burson V6 Vivids are living, and so in theory you can tweak the sound of the volume control using different op amps, but my experience with the classics would suggest that you're actually best to leave the Vivids there. I'll talk a bit more about op amp rolling shortly, but the key thing is the volume control I think should be left alone. It's doing an amazing job at being incredibly transparent, as you can prove by changing the op amps and hearing things get noticeably worse. To put things in perspective, this Muses volume control chip is used in far more expensive equipment, up in the $5,000, $10,000, $15,000 range. So it's a really serious piece of equipment to put in an amplifier at this sort of price point. But in my mind, it definitely pays off. And one of the reasons I say that is that you can actually bypass the volume control altogether. So if you're using this as more of a power amplifier for your headphones and you've got volume control coming from a DAC or a preamp of some sort, then you can actually bypass the volume by long pressing the menu button here. That will remove the Muses 72320 and associated circuitry from the signal path and give you a straight shot through to the outputs. Having tried that though, the difference is really minimal. So whilst there might be a tiny gain to be had, it showed me that the volume circuit in here is incredibly transparent. And often that's the thing that holds back a lot of systems. The other thing I want to talk about in relation to the volume control is the way gain is handled on the Burson. When you switch between the three gain modes, there is a massive difference between low, medium and high gain, particularly between low and medium. And the reason for that is it allows you to use very sensitive IEMs with absolutely no noise, and of course no issues with channel imbalance because of that incredible volume control we've just spoken about. In speaking to Burson, they've put a lot of thought into how they designed their gain stage in order to create a very clean and highly usable volume range for IEM listeners. I've found generally that for full-size headphones, medium gain was sufficient. Perhaps with something a little bit more power hungry, you may choose to move over to the high gain, but in the most cases I found medium was great for headphones, low gain was great for IEMs. Speaking of settings and the like, it's worth talking about the menu options available from the Soloist. When you access the menu, you can choose between which input is being used, the RCA or the XLR. You can also choose which output type you want, whether it's the headphone output or the preamp output, and of course you can choose which gain setting you're using. So it's a fairly simple menu, but that's everything you actually need. And once again, as I've said in other reviews, I really appreciate the fact that the Soloist allows you to choose whether you're sending outputs to, say, active speakers or through to your headphones, and you don't have to manually switch off your active speakers when you want to listen to headphones. As we discussed with the Magnius, it's impossible for amplifiers to self-mute when plugging into a 4-pin XLR socket. There's no way of the amp knowing if it's got a connection there or not. And so it's really important that manufacturers include switches to allow you to disable the outputs on the back when you want the headphones at the front. So things are kept nicely simple with the Soloist. There's not a whole range of options, there's not crazy amounts of settings and details. It's just designed to give you the control over what you really need, and then everything else is to get out of the way and let you enjoy the music. If you're not a fan of accessing menus all the time, there is a really nice little remote control included from Burson, and it's crafted out of aluminium. It feels pretty good to hold. It's not an amazing piece of engineering, but having recently criticised Chord Electronics for their plastic remotes with expensive equipment like the TT2 and the M-Scaler over there, finding a metal remote in the box of a $1,200 device compared to these $4,000 and $5,000 devices was a really nice surprise. The remote, similarly to the amplifier, is very, very simple. It gives you volume and mute control and the ability to switch inputs, and that's all. And I think honestly that's all it needs to be as well.
Up at the stars. I'm caught inside a loop where I can get to your heart, get to your heart. Ooh, you're letting your fears take hold, let them take control, and it's making me crazy. If you could only look at me, you know how I feel, know how I feel. Oh.
So let's talk now a little bit about the sound. I'm going to focus all of my comments on the amplifier as it arrives, which is with 2 pairs of the V6 Vivid op amps. Now let's talk briefly about where those op amps sit. We've got 2 over here that sit in the volume stage, and as I mentioned before, there's really no benefit I can see in switching those. I briefly tried the classics there, and it just made the sound a bit thick and a bit muddy, and I felt like it became a bit veiled compared to the beautiful transparency of that volume control stage when the V6 Vivids are in place. Over on the other side, we've got a pair of V6 Vivids in the input buffer stage, and that's where you have the ability to really influence the sound. Keep in mind that whatever comes in through the input and the way that signal is managed, that's what then gets amplified. So by altering the signal in the input stage, you then affect it throughout the course of the amplifier and out through your outputs. The sound that I heard from the Soloist in its stock form, as you see it here, was incredibly transparent. It's almost as good as the TT2 amplifier in terms of transparency, and that amplifier is designed specifically in the TT2 to keep the signal path as short and simple as possible in order to maximize transparency. So for me, it's very much a benchmark of exactly what the sound is that's coming out of the DAC. Now, that doesn't mean it's necessarily the best amplification, because some will argue that amplification should bring a little bit of character, or maybe can bring a little bit of character without that being a bad thing. So I'm not suggesting that everybody should consider the TT2 as the perfect amplifier, but what it does do is it shows you exactly what's coming out of the DAC. What blew my mind was the fact that when I connected up the Soloist, it was the closest I've heard as yet of an amplifier reproducing what comes out of the TT2's inbuilt amplifier. And in fact, what I found was that it added just ever so slightly an amount of smoothness, so not richness, not warmth, but just smoothness to the sound that I occasionally wish I had from the TT2. The TT2 can be a little bit unforgiving. If you're listening to poor quality recordings, it's going to show you every little bit of issue with those recordings, and sometimes that makes for a poor listening experience. Of course, if you feed it amazing quality recordings, it's going to shine more than anything else that I've heard so far, but certainly the Soloist allowed me to listen to everything from amazing quality recordings that still sounded amazing, all the way through to really poor recordings that were still highly enjoyable. Now don't take this the wrong way, it's not rolling off the treble, it's not glossing over detail, it's just making everything a touch smoother. And to me, that's making the music highly enjoyable, to the point that I'm often finding myself plugging directly into the Soloist instead of directly into the TT2. So ultimately I would describe the sound from the Soloist as being very natural, very analog, but not in that thick or rich sense, just in the sense that there's not any glare, there's not any harshness or that digital sound that you sometimes get from integrated amplifiers. It's incredibly accurate and incredibly transparent, meaning that you're going to hear exactly what's coming from higher up in the source chain, i.e. your DAC and your source. It also presents a really nice soundstage with excellent image focus and really good three-dimensionality. And that's been an ongoing complaint of mine with the various integrated equipment that I've reviewed lately, is they tend to flatten everything. So if you look at things like the Schiit Magnus, the Topping A90, the THX789, they do a really nice job of spreading a left-right image, but they don't do very good at giving us depth in that image. The Soloist fixes that problem, and I can only assume it comes down to the fact that it's a discrete design. I'm still trying to get to the bottom of understanding why this is the case, but so far what I'm thinking is going on is that there might be ever so slight, super tiny timing errors caused by capacitance in the integrated chips. Now this is just my working theory and I might be way off the mark, but to explain that in layman's terms, what I understand is that potentially in some of the chips, or potentially all of the chips for that matter, there's a possibility that the chip substrates and the pieces that make up the chip are actually holding onto the signal a touch longer than it should, and we're talking microseconds here. But given that our brains are accurate with their timing at least 250 kilohertz, there are tiny, tiny timing differences that we can actually pick up. So my current theory on this that I'm trying to get to the bottom of is that integrated circuits may be providing slight timing errors which are actually causing the soundstage to lose depth and become flat, whereas the discrete circuits don't have that same problem and are giving us a much better sense of timing within the output sound. Whether or not that theory is correct, what I'm hearing is absolutely clear, and that is that the Soloist is giving a fantastic resolution and space and size to the soundstage, whereas other integrated amps like those I mentioned aren't doing it as well. Now I'll compare the Soloist shortly to things like the A90 to give you a better sense, but for now just know it's producing a really brilliant sound that is better than anything I've heard at this price so far. The nearest thing that I've heard to it to date would be something like the Auralic Taurus Mark II, which is brilliant, but I have a sneaking suspicion that the Soloist is a little bit more transparent. One final thing before I provide those comparisons is that the sound output from the 6.3mm jack may be slightly inferior to the 4-pin XLR, but it's close enough that by the time I switched between the two and adjusted the volume to make up for the power differences, I was having difficulty really defining what the difference was. So I think there's a slight drop off, but I think it's so minor that you can consider this a really effective, balanced and single-ended headphone amplifier. Likewise, from the inputs at the back, I heard very, very similar and probably identical performance from the RCAs and the XLR inputs. The reason I say probably the same is that I don't have the exact same interconnects for XLR and RCA. And in fact, it's impossible to ever have exactly the same interconnects because the connectors themselves are different. So I would put what I was hearing there down to differences in the interconnects more so than a significant difference between the performance of the two different inputs.
Yeah. Raising the Tobagos, we growing like fresh tomatoes. Them boys on fire, too fuego. We pass it brown hot potato. Everything is nuevo. I'm with my sweetie like Quavo. Need my cheese, need that queso. Need my bread, need that bankroll.
So let's talk now about some comparisons, and all of these are continuing with the V6 Vivids only. I'll talk about the V6 Classics at the end for those that are interested. So against the A90, what I found was that both of these amplifiers are incredibly resolving, incredibly clean and incredibly transparent. What separated the two, as I've already alluded to, was the soundstage presentation. The Soloist was consistently more three-dimensional, whereas the A90 tended to compress everything more. So instead of these sounds having a sense of both physical distance between each other, but also a slight sense of sound drop-off, I guess you'd call it. The A90 brought everything forwards and everything felt like it was at the same exact volume. Whereas with the Soloist, it felt like things that were close to you in the soundstage were maybe a touch louder than things that were further back. Now, I'm not suggesting that that's actually the case, that the volumes were different, but the perception was different. It sounded more lifelike and realistic, as though I was listening to the real performers in their positions within space. My initial impressions of the A90 was that potentially it was giving me a little bit more detail than the Soloist, but realistically what I think was happening was that compression I just mentioned brings everything to the front and kind of masks all of the subtle details with this overall wall of sound. Now, I'm exaggerating the differences here. The A90 is brilliant, it's a fantastic amplifier. This is just another step better again. So I'm not suggesting that they're worlds apart, I'm just trying to paint the picture of what the differences were. And so with the A90, I felt like it was producing more this wall of sound where everything was kind of a similar volume, and the result was that I actually found I was missing mid-range information that was masked by the treble. When I came back over to the Soloist, I was able to hear micro details of textures in guitar strings or the breathiness or the texture of a vocal that I couldn't always hear as well in the A90. I would imagine there are some people that are going to prefer the sound of the A90 because it has that initial impression of detail. But I would encourage you, if you were listening to both of these, to really take your time with both products and see which one you find yourself enjoying more over time. As much as both are great, and I'm sure you'd enjoy both thoroughly, to me the Soloist does pull slightly ahead, and it should do because it costs about twice as much. By the way, I should mention that for the comparison of the A90 and the Soloist, I was using a viewer suggested track, which is A Man Is Not His Song by Feist, and that was suggested by Mr. Rude, so thanks Mr. Rude for suggesting that. And if you've got a suggestion that you want me to try on a future test, do leave me a comment down below and let me know the name of the track, the artist and the album if it's important, and I'll track it down and take a listen. Moving on now, I thought it was worth putting the Soloist 3X up against the old Soloist SL. Now the old Soloist SL retailed for about half the price of this, so it shouldn't be expected to stack up exactly as well as this. There's a reason this is the new model as well, with some new technologies in it, but I was still keen to hear how far Burson had come with their flagship Soloist amplifiers. For this test, I was using Wynton Marsalis' Black Codes album, and that was suggested by Jose Gonzalez, so thanks Jose for the great suggestion. That's a brilliant album. What I found in comparing the two was that there's no doubt that they are siblings. The Soloist SL and the Soloist 3X share a really similar tonality, but you can hear how far the 3X has come with its much more open and transparent sound. The Soloist SL comes across a little bit smoother, a tiny bit thicker in comparison to the 3X. As a result, the 3X has a better sense of clarity and texture to all the sounds because things aren't being smoothed off quite as much. Interestingly, if I was to switch the classics into the 3X, it starts to take a little bit more of the Soloist SL's character, but at the same time does remain more transparent still. So if there is anyone out there that's got the SL and is looking for the next step in the Soloist line, if you enjoy that beautiful rich character that the Soloist SL has, you can get the same but better by buying a 3X and adding in the classics. Moving on to my next comparison, the 3X up against the TT2 that I've already alluded to. So I already mentioned that the TT2 is the king of transparency for me because it basically feeds you directly from the DAC output stage straight to your headphones. Now that's a double-edged sword because, as I've already said, sometimes things get a little bit nasty if you've got a bad recording. So as I alluded to earlier, putting the 3X in the chain really just brings an ever so slight amount of smoothness to the sound from the TT2. The TT2 is probably still slightly more three-dimensional and obviously has a greater sense of transparency and therefore a bit of extra texture in the sound, but the Soloist comes really close and brings a wonderful sense of smoothness to a sound that can occasionally get a bit too honest and a bit too dry. As a part of that, the 3X sounds a little bit more forward in the mids, and so for those of you that do enjoy a vocal, you may actually prefer feeding the TT2 into the Soloist rather than having it direct out of the TT2. The other thing that I love, of course, is I can now plug my 4-pin XLRs straight into this rather than having to use an adapter cable with the TT2. As I said at the beginning, the Soloist is on loan, but I'm absolutely going to be talking to Burson about buying one of these as my future reference amplifier for all my reviews. It's that good and I enjoy it that much alongside the TT2. One test I was really interested to perform was seeing how extreme bass was managed by the Soloist compared to the TT2 with its supercapacitors. So I used the Why So Serious track from the Dark Knight soundtrack as suggested by Saviolage. And I can tell you that the Soloist absolutely kept up toe to toe with the TT2 on the bass passage at about the 3:20 mark. For those of you that haven't checked out that track, it's really worth checking out around about 3:20 to hear what deep, deep bass can really sound like. One of the things I was really listening for here was whether or not the Soloist could handle the texture in the bass as well as the TT2 did. There's a certain amount of air, you can almost hear the movement of air coming in the bass notes during that passage. And in the Soloist, it absolutely kept up. And at times I almost felt like it might have been doing an even better job at driving the headphones to reproduce that sound. Ultimately though, it was really hard for me to know which one was correct and which one was not correct. And so all I'm going to say is it's absolutely as good as the TT2 at producing that bass response. So overall transparency, TT2 still has the edge, but enjoyability and still extreme transparency, the Soloist is doing a fantastic job. Now onto the final comparison, my trusty Mainline over the back here, my tube amplifier. The Mainline has consistently amazed me at how it has equaled or bested incredible amplifiers, to the point that the only thing I've heard so far that is definitively better than it, obviously some other things have been different, but definitively better has been the TT2. So I put the Soloist up against it, keeping in mind that they're priced roughly the same in terms of US dollars, but you still have to build the Mainline yourself. I've also added some capacitors to the Mainline, so its total cost is probably $200 or $300 more than the Soloist here, but they're roughly comparable, taking out the build cost of the Mainline in terms of my time and effort. So what I heard when I put them side by side was that, as you'd expect from a tube amplifier, the Mainline was slightly smoother in its sound compared to the solid state Soloist here. Overall though, they were really, really similar. So transparency levels were very similar, which is a compliment to both amplifiers. The general tonality was actually quite similar. There was just an ever so slightly cooler feel to the Soloist sound compared to the ever so slightly smoother sound from the Mainline. Now anyone who's not familiar with the Mainline and seeing it as a tube amp might be thinking, hang on a minute, you've said this is really clean and transparent and now you're saying it's almost the same as a tube amplifier. Yes, that's true, because the Mainline is not your typical tube amplifier. It's not thick and rich and tubey, it's very transparent and very clean. So what's happening when we compare the two of these is we're hearing solid state done really well, keeping smoothness and naturalness of sound, up against the slightly smoother tube amplifier done well, where it's managing to keep a lot of the transparency and clarity that you normally expect from solid state. Ultimately, these are just two fantastic amplifiers that are very evenly matched with slight character differences between them. One of the things I've always really enjoyed about the Mainline is its ability to render a sense of weight and presence, particularly through mid-range. And I didn't feel like the Soloist was lacking in any way when I put it up next to the Mainline. What that tells me is that the Soloist's discrete design is helping it provide that really rich and real sense of musicality that often the integrated designs don't. Now before I wrap all this up and give you a summary, I just wanted to talk about the swapping of the V6 Classics into the input stage of the Soloist. The Classics for me have been my preferred V6 op amp when using the Burson Fun amplifiers. So the Burson Fun is a very basic amplifier, it's a couple of $100 and it's not on the level of this. However, I still expected to like the Classics more when putting them into an amplifier of this quality. With the Burson Fun, I've often found the Vivids to be a little bit hard-edged and a little bit less enjoyable. But in the case of the Soloist, they are just spot on perfect. Putting in the Classics, I found things got rich and warm through the mid-range. There was a nice sense of analog sound to it. But in this case, when I say analog, I do mean it got a bit thicker and a bit lower in resolution. It wasn't bad by any stretch, but I can absolutely understand why Burson shipped this with the V6 Vivids as standard. Now, according to the Burson website, this Soloist 3X will always ship with the V6 Vivids. So that's obviously the way it's been optimized, and based on my experiences, that's what I'd be choosing to do with it as well, is stick with the V6 Vivids. Some of you who've watched the channel for a while may know that I really love the Sparco's Labs op amps. I haven't had a chance to try them in the Soloist because I don't have the right configuration of 2 dual op amps from Sparco's. I've only got singles. So it's something I will intend to try at some point. I'm not expecting huge gains because the Soloist is clearly optimized for the V6 Vivids, but curiosity says I'll try it at some point, and if I hear anything miraculous, I will be sure to share it with you. For now though, let me sum up by saying that the Soloist is, without a doubt, one of the best amplifiers I've ever heard. Having reviewed the Sparco's Labs Aries, I would actually choose the Soloist 3X over that, particularly given that you could buy about 3 of these for the cost of the Aries. The Aries may have a slight edge in detail retrieval, but it didn't produce the organic and realistic sound that the 3X excels at. To me, the versatility of the various gain modes, allowing use with highly sensitive IEMs all the way through to power-hungry cans, the design, the form factor, just everything about this on top of the incredible sound quality just makes it an absolute winner, particularly at the price. It's obviously not a cheap amp, but you can spend a lot more than this and still not get this level of performance and flexibility. I'm certainly going to be very reluctant to let this go on to the next reviewer, but I also have no doubt that you're going to hear very positive things from that reviewer, whoever that is, when they get their hands on this, have a listen and hear what I've heard. I'm definitely going to be chatting to Burson about buying a Soloist for myself, so you're going to be hearing it used again and again in future reviews, because to me it's at the quality where it can be a reference amp for all sorts of different reviews. So if you're in the market for a well-priced, incredibly performing, highly versatile, and potentially end-game headphone amplifier, I'll put a link down below so you can go through to the Burson website and place your order for your Soloist 3X and enjoy many years of extremely enjoyable listening. For now though, happy listening, go get yourself a Soloist, and I'll see you here next time on Passion for Sound.